there are very, very serious consequences. It's not just family. You're talking about the entire society. You're talking about every friend you've ever had. You're talking about every cousin. You do end up losing all those people. It feels like the old version of you is dead. In my view, I feel like this is the very definition of death.
Imagine growing up in a home where Hitler was admired, Jews were portrayed as the enemy, and Israel represented evil. That was Khaled Hassan's childhood in Cairo, Egypt. But after questioning everything he had been taught, his life took a remarkable turn. Today, he is Jewish. He publicly supports Israel, and he warns the West about the ideology he once believed. How does someone make a transformation that dramatic? What does he know that much of the world still doesn't understand? Khaled, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me.
Can you paint us a picture of what your childhood was like in Cairo? If I was sitting, let's say, at your family dinner table when you were 10 years old, what would I hear your parents saying about, for example, Jews and Israel?
It's actually very interesting. I think this is a very interesting question because you wouldn't hear much. Jews and Israel were not really discussed. They were not discussed because mostly it's not something that, parents in a family like mine, which is middle class, they sent me to an American school, me and my brother. So there was really no discussion of Jews and Israel. But that doesn't mean that it was a positive thing. It actually wasn't. It was. Despite this, you found that there was this almost, blindly accepted view that Jews and Israel are evil. That Jews are horrific. That Jews are basically the descendants of apes and monkeys. And that's despite the fact that, my parents were not political in any way. They didn't really discuss, what's happening in the Middle East. They didn't really discuss, religion. They were not religious. My family was a very sort of, what Westerners would call, moderate Muslims. And I'm saying, I'm saying it this way because I think most people do not even understand that, the definition of moderate is very, very, very different in a country like Egypt, in a Muslim country like Egypt. Because most people actually believe that, moderate means like, oh, you're sort of pro gay rights. That's not the case. You're sort of pro, people having sex before marriage. That's not the case. Like the definition of moderate is wildly different in a place like Egypt. So, it would be normal conversations. It would be conversations about, what we wanted to do, what we, watching a film or whatever. And, especially dinner, I actually remember we always watched the TV while having dinner, which is, again, very different to most, like English families, for example, because I live in England. It's kind of rude to watch TV while you're eating with the family. You just don't do it, But for us, this was the case, you watch TV. But again, it's so deeply rooted that even in families like mine, who were not at all involved in politics, I mean, my dad actually used to say that politics is a dirty business. It's horrific and no one should get involved in it. Nonetheless, you see that these views are basically the mainstream views.
But there was an admiration, I believe, of Hitler, right? Could you tell us that?
Because my father taught German, so he was he had a degree in German. This was what he studied in university, and he wanted to essentially be a tour guide because he loved ancient Egyptian history, and he was a tour guide for a few years as a student actually, and as a young person. But again, it's so deeply rooted. Like I remember the main situations where you see this again fascination and admiration of Hitler was when I asked him, why he had a keychain that was actually a Volkswagen instead of, a Fiat, because he owned a Fiat. And he said, well, because Hitler, this is Hitler's car, and, Hitler killed the Jews, and he admired Hitler. So, he admired Hitler hugely. And I said this before, I remember even in class, in my school, I was drawing swastikas, as a young person when I was attending German classes, because this was like, for us, this was like, that's what Germans do, isn't it? That's just like, that's why we like the Germans, because they are Nazis and we like them and we get along because they're Nazis. And that's, what being German is all about, basically. Obviously, that's not the case. Germans are not Nazis. Obviously under Hitler that's different, but I'm talking about, me growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. So, that's the kind of mindset you're dealing with.
But it does seem like in the Muslim world, there is a general admiration of Hitler. We know his connection with the Mufti. There are, his books are translated into Arabic. So there is kind of like this broad admiration of him, right?
Well, yes. I mean, that's why I'm saying it's deeply rooted, because it's, it's something that is very, very much part of Arab and Muslim culture. It's because if you look at this, and I was talking to an Israeli friend about this, most Israelis and most Jews don't really understand this because they don't fully understand Arab culture. And the problem is, there are so many reasons behind this, but that's mostly because Jews and Israelis have been completely isolated, like completely forced, to have no interactions with Arabs whatsoever. And that means, that they don't fully understand the culture. But if you fully understand the culture, you're going to look at history and you're going to realize that Arab and Muslim nationalism, the collective national identity, is based on a combination of, different forms of Jew hatred. Nazism is one of them. And then there is the religious side. And then there is the nationalist side. And then there is the Russian socialist side, basically. And that's why it becomes really difficult for most people to actually understand where it comes from. But Hitler was loved, especially in Egypt. He still is, because of, the fact that Egypt was under British occupation. And they saw that, the German forces who were advancing towards Egypt and actually made it to Egypt, and, were not very far away from Alexandria, they saw this as a form of liberation. And this is why the founders of modern Egypt, the military officers who founded the modern state of Egypt in 1952, were also huge fans of Nazism, basically, and Hitler.
Now, growing up, did everyone around you think the same way? Meaning in school, the teachers, did they speak like this? The textbooks in the schools, what did they say about the Israel and the Jews?
I'd probably say, like, this view in my family was probably the least extremist. I mean, I don't think there is least extremist, because obviously, liking Nazis is not, there is no, it's not like a nice form or a light form of extremism. It isn't. But my point is, there were many others who were far worse. There were others who were quite seriously involved in, the Muslim Brotherhood and other sort of political movements that were very, very deeply involved in activities and stuff like this that promoted day after day, Jew hatred, essentially. We were not, because like I said, although it's part of the mindset, we were just, sort of like living life, trying to, make the most of it, go to nice school and stuff like this.
So when did that first crack appear in your worldview? Was it a book, a conversation, or one experience that you had?
That's the interesting part. I think this is, again, actually one of the most interesting parts, because most people do not know that in Egypt, people do not read. Like, people just do not read. Like, the average Egyptian reads around one book a year. And that's including newspapers, including, different little bits and pieces that they read. So there was no, reading. There wasn't, a newspaper that changed things. There was also, tragically, none of the stuff that the Jewish community did ever reached me. And the stuff that reached me was seen as, this is Mossad trying to brainwash us. So if, any Jewish organization did something for an Arabic speaking audience, this was seen as like, just forget about this, because this is Mossad trying to brainwash you into loving Jews, which is something that I always bring in my meetings with, Jewish leaders and Jewish organizations. Basically, you failed to reach this Arab audience, not necessarily because it's your fault, but because you did not understand this simple fact. Whatever you produce is going to be seen as Mossad produced, basically. For me, it was actually my personal story. For me, I think, I always say this, I always say I was radicalized into radicalized out of Jew hatred. And radicalized out of Jew hatred for me is, I mean, if you look at radicalization, you're going to see that its very definition is holding views that are fundamentally different to the views of your society. That's
Mhm.
that's the actual definition of radicalization. And I started to hate my society because I didn't want to live the way they wanted me to live. The way it started with me is, I wanted to have a drink. I wanted to, drink wine. I wanted to drink beer. I wanted, to smoke. I wanted to have a girlfriend. And everything around me was saying, no, 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 you can't do this because we're Muslim. And that was the very first stage of feeling like, well, maybe I don't belong to you because you are telling me that what I want to do is banned and should not be done. So maybe I'm just not part of you, basically. That's how it started. But I think also, to be honest, the main factor that helped me actually see that there is a different way was Americans, American TV, American, my American friends being exposed to this, American soft power was a huge factor. It's actually the only factor that really, that I can, say sort of penetrated, my mindset and told me, hold on, there is a different way.
So were you kind of alone in this journey of yours? Did you have any friends? When did your family find out about this? Were you afraid of losing your family?
Well, I mean, being alone, obviously, yes, because you can't even talk to, a very good friend about this, because if you do, it becomes very, very problematic. But I didn't really mind this. I felt like this is just who I am. I felt like I'm just, different in my own way. And I liked being different. I suppose, again, it's many, many different factors shape who we are. And I didn't really mind being alone, didn't really mind sort of standing out in my own different way. When you talk about family and stuff like this, well, yes, there are very, very serious consequences. It's not, just family. You're talking about the entire society. You're talking about every friend you've ever had. You're talking about, every cousin, every, all that stuff. And you do end up losing all those people. You have to bear in mind, you pretty much, that's sort of like, which is why I refer to it as a kind of death, in a way, because I always say, it is death actually, because it feels like the old version of you is dead. Like you see those people, you see them on social media, for example, or whatever. They go to weddings, they go to funerals, they go to birthdays and stuff like this. And you're not there, and they've sort of moved on, like you, and you moved on as well, obviously. So it is, in my view, I feel like this is the very definition of death. This is how, the only difference is you're sort of, it's almost like this is the afterlife where I am, and I can see them, living in this life. So it is what it is, yeah.
At what age did you say that you officially left Islam, like publicly? Well, how old were you?
No, publicly, I did it after leaving Egypt. I did not do it while living in Egypt. I did it. There was an American friend of mine. He was Jewish, and he was the first Jewish person I spoke to. And I started basically telling him that I'm done with Islam and I wanted to convert to Judaism in 2011. So I was 21, which is very young. 21. You know very little actually about these things,
Mhm.
especially if you live in a place where you don't even have access to unbiased information. So I was 21 and I lived again from 2011 to 2016 in Egypt. Everything was sort of normal. There was really not much going on publicly. Like most people did not know about these kind of views that I had. And when I moved out of Egypt in 2016, I kept a low profile because I didn't want anyone that I knew to be harmed back in Egypt. And I would probably say I kept a low profile until at least 2019, started doing very little stuff with the Jewish community, like volunteering. But again, that was, relatively low profile. So it wasn't something, that was known on an international scale or, something that could reach Egypt or whatever. But after October 7th, I started to go really public, like this, everyone in Egypt found out. Everyone, every friend I ever had in the Arab world found out. So, yeah.
Now, what was it about Judaism that kind of got you attracted to it? Why not just become secular? What was it about Judaism?
Well, I was never secular. I was never someone who's, or not secular like an atheist or agnostic. obviously I had doubts. I think having doubts, does God exist? This kind of doubt, or how can God exist if XYZ is happening? I think it's a kind of doubt that I still do have, like this doubt of, if God exists, why did he allow, babies to be kidnapped? That's a different kind of, philosophical question. But I never really stopped believing in God. Even, in sort of the darkest moments of my life, I found out that I'm actually almost, sort of arguing or disapproving, with God, not, not denying that God exists. I did consider Christianity. I love Christianity, by the way. I have to admit this. I love Christianity. I love the history of the Egyptian church. The Egyptian church is a very proud church. It's an amazing church. And it has, I would probably say it is the last stronghold of true Egyptian culture, true Egyptian culture in the sense that, it's not corrupted by Islam. It's not sort of, you still have, a lot of Christians who act like Muslims when it comes to Israel, who act like Muslims when it comes to Jews. But I think they sort of have to, because they have to prove that we are patriots as well. We're not traitors. We're not like a fifth column or whatever you want to say. So I did consider Christianity. I just couldn't really feel like I believed in it. Like, it just, I admire it. I like it. I like the history of, like I said, the Egyptian church and, Christianity generally. And I like Christians, but I just don't feel like it's something I could believe in. And fundamentally, I feel like, after all this journey, I feel like when I look back, I feel like I just had a Jewish soul that was actually sort of pursuing something that even I could not fully understand back then, like, sort of going through the stage of, well, how about Christianity? How about something else? I mean, there was even actually, I never said this before, there was a moment when I was young when I even considered, well, why not, worship like my ancient ancestors worshiped, like, the Egyptians. They worshipped, Amun and, the god of the sun and stuff like this. Why not? And it's, you have all these sorts of ideas. But I just felt like I just couldn't, like everything led, I had doubts, I had questions, I had sort of, I don't feel like this makes sense. Until for me, Judaism felt like, sometimes you put on something and you feel like it suits you, like it's just made for you. And that's how I felt basically.
Now, growing up, obviously, you had a certain view of Jews. What surprised you most after meeting Jewish people and finally getting a chance to see them in person?
They are miserably inept in certain things in this war. Seriously inept for, the nation who's just like, they control the world, they do this. This is bullshit. They can't control 10 minutes in one room to get one thing done. You're always having the guy who argues. You're always having the guy who says, but what about Bibi? What about Trump? What about this? And it just never ends. It just never ends. And it's really agonizing. Seriously inept, I have to say. Seriously inept. If you look at the machine of Israeli government, if you look at the machine of Jewish advocacy, you're going to see that there are some serious fundamental issues that just mean that we're just not functioning the way we should. It's just, I have to be very honest. Maybe some people will be offended by this, but it is seriously and miserably just not working basically. So yeah, I think this is the main thing that stands out. The other thing that stood out, like sort of the first time I was in synagogue, was actually how there are similarities, huge similarities that I think most people do not know. Like most Muslims do not know about Jews and most Jews do not know about Muslims. There are certain similarities in the practices. I think this is mostly because Islam copied Judaism in many ways. But I think just most people who have never sort of, most Muslims who've never been in synagogue do not actually realize that there are huge similarities in different ways.
Now, people hear the phrase radical Islam. What does it actually mean? Is there such a thing as radical Islam? Is it just people that actually keep Islam the way it's supposed to be kept? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that most devout Muslims, most Muslims who follow Islam, follow a radical ideology. And this might be offensive to some people again, but it's just a fact of life. And it's very, very problematic for many reasons because there are certain principles and a certain framework that has been maintained and shaped that makes it virtually impossible to actually reform Islam. And I think this also has been part of my journey, because even until recently, I was, this was a debate that was always on my mind. Can we reform Islam? And if we do, how do we do it? Are there different versions of Islam? I believed until relatively recently that there could be different versions of Islam. I looked at people like, people that I know personally, and I felt like, right, this is a different version of Islam that could be more moderate. But I think what I believe now fundamentally, and again, this is after a lot of developments in the region, working with different, Arab partners and different leaders, is that you eventually find out that there is one of two things: either Islam, which is radical Islam, or there is some kind of suppression of Islam, in the sense of it's almost like you mute something. Do you know what I mean? Just like, right, let's mute Islam when it comes to foreign policy. So let's not discuss doing foreign policy according to Islam, because if we do foreign policy according to Islam, we're going to end up with radical Islam. If we do national security according to Islam, we're going to end up with radical Islam. So some nations or some people basically mute Islam. They decide, no, let's just do it without any mention of Islam. We can still say we're Muslim, and we are Muslim, and we go to the mosque to pray, and we do all that stuff, but we are muting Islam in certain aspects of life, basically. So I think there is only one version of Islam, because Muslims have decided that this is the case. If they decide to create different versions of Islam, or a different version of Islam, I think that would be most welcome. But at the moment, there is just one version, basically.
Now, is Hamas primarily a nationalist movement or a religious movement? What do they actually want?
That's a question that only someone who's non-Arab and non-Muslim would ask, to be honest. Because in places like Gaza, in places like Egypt, in places like, Qatar, in places like Saudi Arabia, there is no such thing. That's one main challenge I have. People have this lens of like, okay, it's almost like, okay, I've got my glasses now, and my glasses are American education or Western education and Western training and Western philosophy, and I'm going to put this on and then see, things like Hamas. Obviously, I'm not blaming you at all. I think it's very reasonable to ask these questions, but I think it's also reasonable to highlight that this question does not exist in the Arab mind, because largely Islam is a nation. So you're going to find, the ummah, the concept of the ummah, the concept of the one nation in Islam. It really does not make a distinction between religion and ethnicity. So you can actually see it very clearly in, even how freely Muslims can travel between Muslim countries. So how they see each other as brothers. You could find someone who was a Muslim from Malaysia, and they go and study in Cairo in Egypt, and they're treated like this is one of us, as if like this is a citizen of the nation of Islam. So really, there is no distinction between jihadism, Islam, or, nationalism in most Muslim communities.
Now, you're saying the West, for example, misunderstands these things. So are we fighting the wrong? How can we fight this radical ideology if we don't understand the ideology? You understand what I'm saying?
I think what we're doing is actually doing the exact opposite. We're not only not fighting, we're actually enabling this ideology. So you're going to see, for example, you're going to see this in so many cases and so many examples. If you look at Canada, for example, they decided recently, we're not going to say Islamic terrorism. We're not going to say Islamist terrorism. We're not going to mention anything that says Islam or relates to Islam at all, because that might be offensive. Instead, we're going to say religiously motivated violence or politically motivated violence. So you're going to find this in all assessments of, national security assessments, foreign policy assessments. Oh, there was a case of religiously motivated violence that happened in Montreal or Toronto or whatever. And then you're just like, well, what do you mean religiously motivated? Is it a Christian guy? Is it a Hindu guy? Is it a Muslim guy? What was it? We're not going to say, because that's offensive. If we say this, we're going to be, racist to some people. So I think we're doing the exact opposite. And I believe it's mostly because people in the West now have realized, well, what the hell do we do? What the hell do we do if we just realize that, what? There is about 6 million Muslims in the UK, for example. How do we deal with this if we are saying their ideology is extremist? What do we do? Like, like, do we have a civil war? What do we do? So instead, let's pretend everything's fine. It's just a few bad apples and, live with that basically.
Now, the US and Israel are currently at war with, let's say, the Iranian regime. Is there any way that they can negotiate with them if their goal is religiously motivated? Meaning, are they ever going to compromise on something that they claim is what Allah wants them to do? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, from your lens, how do you view this war?
It's very interesting because we've been talking about this for months now, since February when it started. And I have been saying there is no point negotiating whatsoever. If you try to negotiate, you're only humiliating yourself and you're going to end up seen as the side that's been defeated. And you're going to end up with more of a hardline view or stance from the Ayatollahs. And the funny thing is, the Americans did not listen. They just decided, no, we'll negotiate. We've got the best deal makers here. We're going to negotiate. And the more they negotiated, the more they found out, you know what? You're just losing it. You're completely just, there is no hope. This is hopeless. Everyone is now laughing at you. Before the war, everyone was just like, whoa, what's going to happen? There was sort of this anticipation and sort of, fear of what President Trump might do to the Iranians, well, to the Ayatollahs. And after everything that he's done, it ended up actually, right, everyone is laughing at him. Tehran is laughing at him. The Pakistanis are laughing at him. The Arabs are laughing at him. And sadly, that's the case. So, but I always said, and I've been saying this consistently, in my tweets and in my analysis, that the war will eventually happen. Like, there will be a full-scale war eventually, because no matter what you do, this is a mindset. This is an enemy whose eschatology, theology, and ideology means that they have to go to war. There is nothing else. They either wait and develop a nuclear weapon and then go to war, or they go to war today. So that's up to the Americans. And if the Americans continue to refuse to allow them to have a nuclear weapon, basically, then they will go to war today. So that's what we're facing, and that's what you see. I think President Trump today went completely mental and said, we're going to blow the whatever, and started swearing, because he just realized what we've been saying for months. We've been saying this for months, and it's been hopeless. And he just reached that point. He was like, actually, no, we're just going to have to go to war, So, yeah.
Now, why do you say that the Muslim Brotherhood is one of the most influential Islamist movements in the world? And how are they different from the radical groups like ISIS and Hamas?
Because they are far more organized. They have a long-term strategy, because they have managed to not be as violent as Al-Qaeda and all these groups. So they are not, lunatics out there saying, oh, we want to kill everyone. No, they're not. They're just presenting themselves as an Islamic alternative to tyranny. That's the main point. So they present themselves as, we are a legitimate, non-violent Islamic alternative to dictators. So that's basically the case. And because of this, they have given themselves a degree of legitimacy in the West, specifically because the West loves a Muslim victim, and they see them as Muslim victims. Those are people who are religious, who are persecuted, and the only problem is that they are saying we are a legitimate Islamic alternative to dictators. So the dictators are clamping down on them or cracking down on them. And that's why they're very smart, because this gives them so much room to deal with non-Muslims and recruit with non-Muslims. They recruit people who are Muslims but are very, very open. They recruit people who are extremely liberal, in many ways. even, women who are, you could see women who wear bikinis and stuff like this, and they still actually align with the Muslim Brotherhood in many ways. And that's why it's extremely successful. It's also extremely successful because of the circumstances of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood was established in Egypt around 1928. Since then, they have survived and actually largely outsmarted British intelligence, American intelligence, Egyptian intelligence, you name it. They have been always able to, using an Islamic framework, to survive any attacks, to survive any sort of measures cracking down on them, and keep a low profile and sort of continue to exist and survive until, there is the right moment, and then they actually show up.
How much influence does the Muslim Brotherhood have in Europe today, and how much influence do you think that they have in the United States?
So the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe is mostly focused on London, mostly England, so Britain. They have a huge influence in Britain, and I think this is going to be very, very, very hard to fight in any meaningful way. It's going to be really hard to fight. But I also don't want people to believe that the extremism we see, the Islamic extremism, is because we have the Muslim Brotherhood, because that's another lie. I don't want people to believe in another lie. The Muslim Brotherhood is a vile organization. It's one of the most evil organizations that exist, basically. But even if you take the Muslim Brotherhood out of the equation, you're going to end up with a demographic of Muslims in Britain who are still extremist. Let's put it this way. Yeah.
Why is it that Muslims that live outside of Arab countries in the West end up becoming more extreme than the Muslims that live in Arabic countries?
Because non-Muslim countries are ruled by non-Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
So Muslims in Egypt who rule Egypt, they make sure that every mosque is monitored. They make sure that national security, that the spies, that, their informants and all that stuff monitor the mosques. They raid mosques, they close down mosques, they attack mosques if they have to. But we don't. In Britain, we don't. So we just give them, this huge room to actually grow and to do whatever they want and operate freely. And we tell them that the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, is not a terrorist organization. So we're basically telling Muslims, you could be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Britain. That's completely fine. We're actually telling them this, effectively. So the other thing is, it's also our education system. We have built an education system in the West that basically says Muslims are victims of Western colonialism, imperialism, and conquest, and whatever, So we are basically telling them we are the enemy. The white non-Muslim man has oppressed you, and it's time for you to basically rise against this oppression. And we're trying to make it up for you, but, it's not enough. So we've given them all the circumstances. I feel like sometimes when you think about it, it's almost like somebody wanted this to happen. Somebody sat down and said, how do we make sure that our countries become very safe and very welcoming for Muslim extremism?
Now, you said you became more public after October 7th. Where were you on October 7th, and what shocked you more? Was it the attack itself or the celebrations that you saw afterwards?
No, the celebrations did not shock me at all, actually, at all. I think what shocked me was the response from people around me. I was actually at home. I woke up, and I just looked at my phone, and I just saw this sort of, news saying, something is happening in Israel, there is an attack, and I thought, initially I thought, right, it must be just rockets and, it's not a big deal, not really something major. But then when you sort of read the news and sort of, scrolled through what was being said, you realize this is actually really bad. I think my main concern on the day was, is this going to be a multi-front invasion? So, or, is someone from Jordan going to do something? Someone from Lebanon, someone from Syria, someone from Egypt? That was my main concern. And, thankfully it wasn't this bad, because I think it could have been a lot worse, actually. The other thing is, there was this shock of how did Israel just sort of not see this? How did they miss this? But the most, the clearest shock for me was people around me. Like when you talk to people around you and say, even family members, to be honest, and you say there's something happening. Like, I mean, I'm saying British family members. And you say there's something happening and it's, this happened today. And they just sort of expect you to get on with the day as if, it's like, oh, it's just like a small stabbing or whatever, basically just like, yeah, it's, just like, so what are we having for dinner today? Just like, like sort of move on, ask questions that almost ignore everything. It's almost like, let's just move on. Let's just, sort of like, we have to get on with our day, don't we? Sort of like, and I found this really, really troubling, actually. I sort of wish I was in Israel. I sort of wish I was actually in Israel because I would have been, the response would have been more in line with how I felt, not sort of the opposite, because it was really unpleasant. It was really, really unpleasant, actually.
Now, what was your reaction of Israel, of how they waged this war in Gaza, the criticisms of Israel? Was there any other way they could have done this war? What are your thoughts on that?
I think Israel should have been more decisive. Israel should have been quicker, basically, to deal with this. Israel dragged its feet around some very core issues early on. I understand why, I understand the mindset, I understand the rationale. But as I was saying back then, there were many things that Israel should have done much sooner and much more decisive, much more, we're doing this and that's it. We're not going to justify, we're not going to chat, we're not going to, just sit around the table and talk about, oh, what would America think? Oh, what would Britain think? No, just do it, get it done, move on. Like this was really quite desperate, I would say. For example, I actually said early on that Israel should take the Rafah crossing with Egypt, and they should have done this much, much sooner. If it was up to me, I would have done this actually as one of the very first steps. The IDF should have gone and cut off the connection between Gaza and Egypt, and then moved and proceeded from two directions. So from the south and from the north. That's how it should have been done. Instead, the IDF moved from the north first and, kept on going, and then did the Rafah thingy. And then, and that was a big scandal. The Rafah stuff was because obviously there were many parties involved trying to make it seem like Israel is essentially dismantling the peace treaty with Egypt by doing so. So I think what Israel did made it seem like Israel is escalating after months of war. So like Israel started, responding on almost October 8th. And the initial response was weak, and then it built up for very obvious logistical reasons. You have to get the soldiers ready and everything. But then it built up, and then it continued to sort of escalate. And that made it a lot worse for Israel to justify its action, because every time Israel escalates, it's like, hold on, why are you doing this now? This whole thing has been ongoing for like 8 months. Why are you escalating now? What I wanted Israel to do was to escalate immediately, like really hugely escalate, and then de-escalate. And that would have been much more, much easier to sell, to public opinion.
What does the Arab world actually think about the Palestinians? Do they actually sympathize with them, or are they using them as a tool? For example, the Islamic regime of Iran, do they actually care about Palestine, or they just want to wipe off Israel off the map? Like, which one is it?
So there's a huge difference between Palestine and Palestinians. People view Palestine as this is the Muslim cause, this is the mosque, this is all that stuff. And this is completely detached from Palestinians, because when it comes to Palestinians, the overwhelming majority of Arabs don't really care. I'm talking about average people. I'm talking about an Egyptian plumber. I'm talking about an Egyptian, accountant. I'm talking, about the person who's, a taxi driver. They don't really care because everything is so hard financially and people are really struggling that there is just no interest. There is no interest to be like, oh, I would go to Palestine if they cared enough. Let me put it this way: if they cared enough, you'd have seen an entirely different response. They don't care enough, but what happens is, you know, different players across the region and across the governments of the region use this for different reasons. So they mobilize people. They start sort of push certain narratives. They start to sort of, make this the only subject that's discussed in the media for, again, different reasons. I think it was a few months ago, maybe even a year now or longer potentially. The Egyptian government actually decided to put people on buses and send them to the Rafah crossing. So they went there, to basically protest against Israeli aggression and stuff. And it was organized by the Egyptian government. And it was organized to also coincide with a visit of some European leader. I think it was Macron of France, and some UN celebrities, basically.
Do you think that the Palestinians in Gaza can ever genuinely coexist with Israel? Or is this a cycle that's just going to keep repeating itself?
I don't think so. I don't think they can coexist with Israel at all, actually. I mean, mind you, I don't think Egypt can coexist with Israel in the sense of actual coexistence. Because coexistence for me, it's not just, okay, you stay here, we're going to stay here, and that's it. Because this doesn't work eventually. Because, coexistence means that you actually see the humanity of the other side. But if you keep things as they are, like, okay, you stay, on this side of the border and I stay on this side of the border, but I'm also promoting Jew hatred on my side, then eventually someone will come, some leader will come, or some, political party or whatever it is, or some movement, and they will say, no, we're fighting you because we have to, because that's what they've been breastfed for generations. So I don't believe that this, sort of coexistence can exist. Coexistence has to happen with serious measures for coexistence. You have to allow Jews to travel to your country and to be seen in your country, like the UAE does. That's actual coexistence, because, despite all political differences, despite any challenges, you see Jews as human. That's, in my view, that's coexistence. I don't think the Egyptians, I don't think the Gazans, or the Palestinians generally, or the Jordanians, or the Syrians, or many in Lebanon can actually coexist with Israel.
Some people make the claim, like, look at Japan after World War II. They were able to be de-radicalized. Maybe we can de-radicalize the Palestinians in Gaza. Is that even a possibility to de-radicalize this population?
It's never been done before. It's never been done before in this context, in the Middle East, in, sort of a Muslim context. We've never seen it done before. People will also give you the example of Germany. Oh, look what, how Germans sort of were de-radicalized. It's just, again, you're presenting very different examples, and the analogy just does not hold water. It's not sensible, it's not consistent, and it doesn't make sense, basically. What I want to see is a population of Muslims that has been de-radicalized. Does this exist? Largely no. I would say largely no. Some people will say the UAE, the Emiratis, but the Emiratis were never actually extremist. The Emiratis in their entire existence were never extremist. You're never going to see the scale of, you will see sort of isolated cases of extremism, in the Emirati society. Yes, that did exist. It doesn't exist today, mostly. It's very, very rare to see an extremist Emirati today. It's extremely rare, actually. So again, it doesn't really exist. I want someone to show me an example. And you know what? We're, as the Egyptians say, إحنا فيها. إحنا فيها means we're in it. Like, we're actually in it. Why don't you show us? If you're saying that you can de-radicalize a Muslim population of, millions of people, go ahead, just do it. It's.
Now, have you visited Israel before?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
You did? What surprised you most about your visits to Israel? What did you see that people don't see on TV?
I think for me, it was definitely how similar Israeli society is to Arab society. Like, there are so many similarities, not all of them good, by the way, because there are similarities when it comes to bureaucracy. Bureaucracy in Israel is really, really disappointing. It's just like, everyone who knows Israel, who truly knows Israel, will know that bureaucracy is very disappointing. Also, there are little things that most people don't notice. Like I got in a taxi to take me to Jerusalem, and I was really exhausted. And then the taxi driver switched off the meter, and he decided to sort of charge me, in his own way, because I was speaking to him in English, and he thought, this is a British guy or an American guy, and I can sort of scam him. I was too exhausted to even, to even argue with him. I was like, just whatever. But there are things, this sort of the hustler sort of mindset of, the Israelis working in the souk, and all that stuff, and, how loud they are and how they're trying to sell their stuff. That's very Arab, in a way. It's actually quite funny, but again, it's the culture. I think for me, the reason I love Israel, besides, obviously religious stuff, besides political stuff, besides all that stuff, it's just because I feel like it's a very Middle Eastern society, but without the nasty stuff. The nasty stuff like a dictatorship. The nasty stuff like, telling people what to do. Like telling a gay person that you cannot be gay here, or telling, a couple that you cannot hold hands, or you cannot kiss, whatever it is, So for me, Israel is a perfect country because it's got the weather, it's got the food, it's got the culture, of a Middle Eastern society, but without all the nasty, horrible stuff that, for me, makes life in Egypt unbearable, basically.
Has social media become Hamas's greatest strategic advantage? And what role do you think that AI plays in spreading their propaganda?
I think it's actually very challenging because for me personally, I have had a very positive relationship with social media because this was, in Egypt, this is how I communicated with Jews for the first time ever. And also, I worked, professionally in moderating content, that's related to terrorism, that's related to extremism, and related to even sexual exploitation of children. So I've seen the very nasty side, like really seriously nasty. And obviously, after October 7th, I think we've seen, how things go. So I would probably say it's not Hamas's greatest strategic victory. I think it's the West's greatest strategic failure. Because collectively, you will see that we are facing billions of people who are fundamentally anti-West. So, for example, there are almost 15 million Jews globally. There are more people who live in Cairo alone. So,
Mhm.
social media becomes, this sort of town square, this massive global town square. You're going to see that Jews are hugely outnumbered, which is why you also see on social media, that the pro-Palestinian side or the pro-Hamas side actually reporting Jews and making sure that Jewish accounts, social media accounts are reported and sort of, suspended or whatever it is, because they can easily decide, okay, we're going to, if one Arab who's got like 10 million followers can say to their followers, I want you to report this Jewish account for violence or whatever it is, this account will get 1 million reports out of the 10 million followers. And that basically means that this account is going to be hugely restricted and under attack. I don't think there is a framework that is even considered to address this. And that's the main problem I have. No one in the West seems to be doing anything about this.
Now we've spoken about your journey and everything you've gone through, losing family and friends and your home and all that. This journey came at a very high cost. But was it worth, do you think, every sacrifice that you made? Going back, would you make the same decisions? What is your life like now? Maybe
Yes, I
you can
definitely
share
would
with
because
us.
it's look, it's I don't like lying. I don't like pretending that something is what it isn't. So yes, it's an unequivocal yes. I definitely would, do what I did. But I think there are moments where you feel like, I've put a lot of people through a lot of stuff that they should not have been put through. There are moments where you have this and you have to admit this. Otherwise you're not human, or you're not being honest to yourself. And there are moments where, when I feel like I really do miss Egypt because, I'm actually a very patriotic Egyptian. And this is what most Egyptians would not believe. Like, I want Egypt to be in the best possible position. I want Egypt to do well. I want Egypt, I want Egyptians to be civilized, to be, sort of doing well economically, doing well when it comes to their own personal freedoms and all that stuff. So I do feel like I miss Egypt a lot. But to be honest, I feel like after 10 years, I have changed in many ways that I don't think I actually noticed while I was changing. Like it's very difficult to explain, but it's just like sometimes you realize I'm just not who I used to be anymore. So it's, this whole question, I think I'm going to continue to really sort of find this challenging for probably the rest of my life. Well, I have no regrets about the decisions I made, but again, it's a question of, I suppose, who I am and who I was. Like sometimes when I've been doing this more recently than ever before, and when I look back, I realize that there are things that happened that I never even had the chance to pause and reflect on. So yeah.
Well, Khaled, I want to thank you for your time and for this conversation. I truly appreciate it. Learned a lot. Your transformation is very inspiring. And I want to thank you for having the courage to do what you did, because most people don't, unfortunately. How can people follow you on social media or your channels? You want to let them know? The floor is
Yes.
open to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. I think these conversations are always really helpful for me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity, because again, I think you need to reflect when people ask you these questions. I think it's really such a great opportunity to actually pause and reflect on many things. I'm usually on Twitter, and I'm also on Substack, and I have my own channel on YouTube where I actually talk about lots of stuff. So anyone who wants to follow, please, I'll leave the links and they can follow me and keep in touch.
Okay,
Thank you.
amazing. Thank you. Thank you. All the
Thank you.
best.